Okay, everybody, Philosophy Society, we're here again. It is August 2nd, 2023. And last time we were talking about the difference between like feeling our emotions in some ways and differentiating between self-awareness of, the self-awareness of being emotional and then just being in the emotional state itself. And that's important so that we can have some self-control and then make decisions based on what our instincts or emotions are telling us. And this is assuming that we're not engaged in like some kind of distorted thinking or something like that, right? Today, I think it's important to kind of just like grasp like the human condition in some ways, you know? We always like to do like an axis, so there's like time, and as the human being, we're going through time, and then there's different stages of our development, obviously. So like if every increment's like 10 years, we have to make decisions about who we are and what's going on with us. And depending on our environment, this is like the environment, what's around us, the context that we're in, we're going to pick up different things and feel different things, and there'll be a change in trajectory, right? So there's some direction we're going in life, and there can be some goal. And these goals can be based on different things. It can be like a projection into the future, a version of our current state, right? And so it may change throughout time. Like in our early development, when we're kids, there's a lot of molding of our identity, and the cultural factors influence what we value, right? And so that's like a function of like socialization. So values and our identity, is kind of like a higher ordered part of who we are. And your values are part of that, right? So we will do certain things based on some value that we have. And there may be some like universal values that most human beings will all agree on, like the avoidance of pain, for example, or self-preservation, so like, but then there could be like specific values to the individual, like if you like to play soccer or you like to read a specific kind of book, right? And so those things will have different meaning to us, and it will change our trajectory. So there could be different kinds of goals. Goal A, goal B, etc. And so whether or not you choose goal B versus goal A is contingent on a whole bunch of factors. And so as we're going through time, as we're aging and we're kind of picking up different things, the notion of feeling and emotion, feeling, or in some ways self-awareness, and then our emotions, is important. It's important for our well-being, right? And in some ways, it's like how you're living your life. And the well-being part, or the how that we're living our life, that I think falls somewhere in the category of wisdom. So when we go back to like our Venn diagram, when we talk about wisdom, we would say like the good life is part of that. And so it's inside the circle. It's within the category of being wise. And so depending on what occurs in our life, we can evaluate whether our life is good or bad. And in some ways that might determine what your well-being is at. If you don't feel that you are in a position where you have a good life, then your emotions can reflect that. And that can be like, the consequence could be like depression, for example, right? So if I don't have a good life, meaning that it's meaningful, then we can feel depressed. And essentially, that stage of depression, if that's the result that we've ended up at, wherever it falls on the scale of our lives, is really just another means for us to be aware of what it is that is making us feel this way, or what it is in our circumstance that's not giving us that sense of good life, right? So how can we do that? And part of it is being aware of who we are, what our values are. And then the next thing would be like, partly is our habits. And not a lot of people are necessarily mindful of their habits. They kind of just like take it with a grain of salt. They're like, this is just who I am. They can't be changed, you know, to their detriment, because the human condition permits us to change our behavior depending on, like, let's assume a normal like neurological structure. There's no brain damage or developmental disorders. And so because of the fact that you through neuroplasticity, you can change your habits and you can learn stuff, that means you can learn, hypothetically, how to live a good life, right? We can be mindful of what it is that's going on in our experience and then change it such that when we do a self-awareness check, we can say, hey, I am feeling good now, or this was a pleasant experience, or whatever was going on, we've dealt with it in some ways. So recently in my housing program, so there's like the leader, and then there's like the people. So it's person 1, person 2, and person 3. There's other people, but there's only 3 relevant to the situation. So person 1 had some problems with person 2 and person 3. Person 2 and person 3 are in a relationship, and there was some conflict between these two, the individual and then the other 2. And person 2, this person just wanted this person to be removed, just get them out. And this person wanted this person to be removed, just get them out, right? And so how do we resolve this conflict, right? As a problem of living. And how do we increase the well-being of them? Because if they're in a close proximity, you know, if they consistently get these negative feelings from seeing the person, that's going to be an issue. And the same thing would be with the workplace, right? And so the first step is to be aware of, you know, what your issue is. It doesn't really matter what they are. And then the sub-step for that one is to distill out like what's in your control, what's in the other person's control. Make sure you're not just being disrespectful, right? Like we have to, what do we mean by issue, right? It has to be real. It can't just be like emotionally loaded or like labeling in the David Burns book and stuff like that, right? Like you're an asshole, and calling somebody an asshole, or, you know, it's the behavior that's the issue, not always our perception of what's going on, right? Our perceptions can be off. And so we want to have some kind of a self-check or regulation to make sure that what issue we are identifying is something that the other person can change, right? So there's an element of control. We want to make sure there's no distortions, et cetera, et cetera. So the first part is person 1 says, I have three issues. So P1 has 1, 2, 3 problems, whatever those things are. And then person 2 and person 3 would identify their issues, whatever those might be, right? And so we would do this. So the organizer or the leader or the person in charge first would speak to these individuals independently, right? So that you can kind of do step 1 for them. What is it that you actually have an issue with, right? And is it a legitimate concern? And then because we don't want someone to try to control another person, right? And so what we're really doing is we're saying, well, what do you feel? We go back to this awareness thing. You're somewhere in your trajectory of life, you're in your environment, and there's some external thing. You're determining what decisions to make here. And then we want to look at our values. And some people might have habits. Like, for example, person 1 was being insults from person 1, right? And so because person 1 didn't see it that way, or was just engaged in denial or not accepting that they were doing anything wrong, really. And so what we can do is we can just say, well, that's an issue of your perception. You may not perceive it to be the case that you are intentionally causing harm, right? But the consequence of whatever you're doing is harmful to these other people. And because it comes from you, it's fundamentally your responsibility, right? So like, like being a bully or making fun of somebody because of where they're at in life. Like, you don't have your career together. You don't know what the hell you're doing, something like that. Or you don't deserve to be in a relationship with this person. You're not a high value person, so they should just break up with you, right? Those kinds of things are not really kind, And so independently, you evaluate and assess what these issues are. Then you say, well, let us come together and communicate about these things together. Are you in agreement, right? Because part of the principle of being in a group, like whether it's the workplace or it's this housing thing that I do, it can be, we have to get along and live together in a healthy environment. It can't be an abusive environment, right? So there's certain principles that if you violate the principles, you're kind of breaking the rules, right? And so principles which are based on values. So the principle would be like more of an action statement, but the core value within it would be like being pro-social in contrast to anti-social, right? Like, and pro-social stuff would, for an example, would be like being kind and then not disrespectful. Right? I think another one would be like regard for others. So you care. You don't have to go out of your way and do stuff for people all the time. You know what I mean? Like, you have your own life to take care of, but you would not want them to suffer harm. That's like care. I care that you don't get hurt, or whatever that is. And so, and then another one's like cooperation. To more explore what we mean when we say pro-social. And if one of the individuals, whether it's the workplace, a family, right? You would say, if you are not being cooperative, you're violating the principles of the group, of principles of like group cohesion. And so if they want to stay in the group, right, then they're going to have to follow those principles. It's going to be a goal, an ideal goal, and then you're going to live towards that standard. And then what we would do is we would look at specific behaviors or circumstances. So this could be environment or situational, right? So we could say, well, this social context, when you are acting in an insulting way towards this person, right, that creates, it violates the principles of group cohesion. And so we have some objective standard to evaluate the behavior with, right? Yeah. So, and if this goes unchecked, what can happen is the people will not feel good, right? It will go contrary to this whole notion of living a good life, because if you're at the workplace, for example, and this is something that, like, how do we resolve conflict in the workplace between employees? You know what I mean? And it's the same way. And so fundamentally, you just expressing your emotions in a controlled, mindful way, like there's being like aggressive and saying like, fuck you, and like being angry and malicious, that you are expressing your emotions there, right? But it's not like a self-aware way. It's like I've lost myself in that moment. The aggressive spirit has taken control. I've been, we need to be exercised now because I'm not in control, right? That's not good. What we really want is for you to communicate to the other person what it is that's upsetting you. Like, what happened in this context that has made you feel that thing, whatever that thing might be, right? And then, so there's steps. When we get to like the conflict resolution stage where everyone's together. So number one is to, whoever is going to speak, there's the, you express what you feel. And then that's like person one. And then person two, they listen. It's important because people will cut each other off. So as the mediator, your role is to help this person in their expression. Well, what do you mean by that? And so certain things we would do, micro things, is Socratic, right? Make sure that things are relevant. And so allow the person to express what they're feeling. Second thing would be the other individual that the criticism is about, they need to listen to whatever that criticism is and then demonstrate understanding. So they would summarize. So, and we know that they understand when person one confirms, yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about, right? And then step 3 is an action plan. Action / agreement. So it's getting a little low. It's hard, right? Okay. Okay. And so that's like instance number 1. And so usually, like you can say, well, who goes first? Like I just did it, I flip a coin. Sometimes somebody who's more upset will just dominate and just start talking, which is fine. Just let them express themselves. Yeah.
Is this the same thing as the disowning technique, or are they 2 different things?
They're different things, but it's similar. It's very similar. Very good. And so this is more of like the disarming technique applied to like a mediation, a group mediation, you know? And just so when we do like a little self-check before the conflict resolution and then after, the person before would say, when we said, I want them to be kicked out. I hate this person. I don't want to live with them. Right? And then after you say, is there anything that you can feel that you would like to communicate? And the response was, no, there was so much that I was feeling before, and I was overwhelmed with how upset I was, but now it's all gone. And I don't care anymore. I don't feel negative. I don't feel upset. Just being able to have the person hear you say, this is how your behavior affects me, is almost enough in itself, right? And we go back to these principles of group cohesion, and we say, for you to be part of this group, there's a certain method or way that we will deal with conflicts, whatever those conflicts might be, right? And sometimes I'll give people the chance to deal with it on their own, even knowing that they might fail, right? Knowing that they may not be able to communicate clearly, or they may become a little aggressive and it won't go anywhere, but just give them the chance, because that way you're respecting their autonomy and their self-determination, that they are making a choice volitionally on their own. And if it doesn't work, now you can come in and help out. So it's not too paternalistic, like you're not parenting them too much or taking away their control, right? So you go through all the issues: expression, listen and summarize, which is the understanding part, and then action plan. It's basically the exact same thing as the discernment technique. And then how we kind of mediate it through is like being Socratic. So saying, you know, don't bring up irrelevant stuff. And the thing is like the insulting behavior actually occurred during the conflict resolution, because the previous person, or person one, didn't really know. They don't see it that way, right? And so whatever cognitive structure that they're coming with, like their mind, you know, it's almost, you know, like another. This is like the environment, and then you have like another. This is like your mind. You know, you like your mind / like the brain that it's based on may have certain limitations. We all do to some degree. We all have strengths and weaknesses. And when I say that, what I mean is that if this person is being insulting, they may not even be intending to do so. So I'm trying to give them the benefit of the doubt. Right? Even though their behavior is harmful, why are they doing it? You know, if it's a habit and it's automatic, they just might not be aware, right? I'll at least give you that. But even if you're not aware, you're still responsible for it, because it's within your boundary, right? It's coming from you. You have to figure something out, right? And this social approach here, right, to dealing with problems in our lives is better than completely, you know, removing people from our lives, and if you don't respond, I don't know if it was last week or the week before, I said if we're passive and we allow these instances to build up, then we can get ourselves into a situation where we're getting upset and we have like an outburst, right? So it's important to be responsive. You want to do something, you know, and everybody was in agreement. So it wasn't that I had to force them to sit down and talk about this, They were motivated intrinsically to do it on their own. And so there's a sense of wisdom, whether you're a manager or whatever you're doing, as to when is the right time to intervene. I was ready to do this weeks ago, but it wasn't the right time. And the only time it's the right time is when all the parties are really, they really want to do it, because they want that platform to exercise their expression. They want the other person to be there, and they want to say, this is what you've done. At least that's what I've perceived. And when the person says that, they identify their issue, they express the thing, we also want to make sure it's based in fact and evidence. And some people, like maybe their memory's not that good. Or if you don't pay attention to the thing, you're not programming it or processing it or encoding it into your memory. Therefore, when you go to retrieve that memory, it doesn't exist. It's like not saving the data on your laptop or whatever. If I don't save it, there's nothing to load. And that's simple as just not paying attention to something, right? Like you say, what is the room number? If we didn't look at the number or previously stored in memory in the past, we wouldn't know. Or how many chairs are in the room. We didn't count and check. We can have an estimate, but to know, to have it as a memory is different. So someone, they may just not be paying attention to what they're doing because that's just the way they live their lives. It's so fundamental to how they respond to their environment or situations, they don't even see it. Like a fish in the water, or how we're very rarely aware that we're breathing air or that we're walking through. Like we live in a gaseous world. Like there's gas all around us, oxygen and other chemicals, and we breathe it and we survive from it. We never really think about it, right? Yep.
Isn't that how narcissists function? That they kind of just do things without evaluating how that affects people around them.
Yeah.
And they just keep going and going.
So in this case, if one of these individuals was a narcissist, this is a big deal. That most of the time, the narcissist in most social situations, right? Because of the context of this, there's a stronger motivation for these people to stay in this context and go through this methodology, right? And the first thing, because this person, one of the people does show signs of narcissism, the strong bond between the group leader and each member, that's something that's super important. That almost has to be stronger than every other node, right? And that's based on, you can talk about values and interests and stuff like that, but it's based on our affect together, right? How I make you feel, how I deal with things with you, right? Other things that you gain from the relationship. So a lot of people, they gain wisdom from me. They learn things from me, right? And that's just what they value. And so if you're in a situation with narcissist and then person, right? And there's a very weak relationship, and then you say, I want to do a conflict resolution thing, it can just break the relationship. They'll say, no, that makes me uncomfortable. They won't say that, but that's how they'll process it. This is uncomfortable. You're making me uncomfortable. I'm not going to talk to you anymore. Right? But you're like, I'm just trying to communicate that you're insulting to me when you call me an asshole, or when you speak to me with an aggressive tone, or you're patronizing. Right?
Like when they just hang up the phone on you, for example.
Sure. And so in most circumstances, that's why CBT doesn't work with narcissists, right? They don't process the world that's the same way. But in this circumstance, this social environment, in some ways they are forced to do that, but not from an external motivating property. It's their own values keep them there. And so certain properties, with like the benefits of what I provide in this environment, are greater than the weakness of their personality. Whereas if you go into a therapy session, right? First of all, narcissists very rarely would even go to therapy because they don't think they need help, right? If they do go there, what is the strength of the bond in this relationship? Maybe like their partner is going to leave them, or they're going to get fired from work, or there's a legal impetus, like they're forced because of law to take therapy. But in this context, the group cohesion property, right, I'm observing a phenomena where it is more powerful than the symptoms of the disorder, which is a big deal because it means that there's a way to treat the disorder. And that's not really been done very well. Yeah.
But feel free to, if there's privacy issues, feel free to not answer this question.
Mm-hmm.
So in this case, person one insulted person two. Is that right? Person one.
Yeah.
And which one has more narcissistic?
Person one.
Okay, so person one has narcissistic tendencies, and the insulted person two.
Yeah.
All right. Do you think that you discussed things and seemed okay, but do you think that it was an insult, right? Sort of like an insult, like to what extent was it like sort of the emotion of contempt that there is something inherently wrong with you? Like that's what I call contempt. There's something inherently wrong with you. Was it something like that, the insult? Or what did he say?
It's okay. So because person one is the demonstrating traits of narcissism, one of the things is the sense of having to be superior in all social situations. And the way that they demonstrate that is by using a downward social comparison. I'm better than you because I'm in better shape. You keep on looking at me because you're envious of my body. Things like that. Yeah. So it's not even really person two or person three that is the issue. Right? Because if you do like let's say you leave the dishes out and then I insult you because of a mistake that you made, that's like we could take the insult away and we could still have me criticizing the mistake. Whereas if every way whenever I'm thinking about my relationship to others, if the way I understand them in relation to me is insulting in itself, that's just how I process stuff. It's way more challenging because it's just the way that the person looks at the world, which is a fundamental property of, we would say, their personality, right?
Yeah. So do you think in this case, person two, he's probably saying that things are better after discussion. Do you think that deep down, he's relatively okay to the extent that it would be relatively functioning well in that environment, or do you think that there is still things that he may not be feeling okay considering what?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's like, okay, so if you have like we got rid of all the emotions in that moment, because before the conflict resolution meeting was done, I was like, is there anything else you can feel? Like, take a minute to just sense yourself. Is there any feelings that come to mind so that we can communicate them now? Right? And then that's what he said. It's so overwhelming. Like earlier, now I've expressed all my feelings and I can't tell. So because there was so much intensity, right? He may be used to just a really intense feeling and not be sensitive to more minute disturbances in his being, right? And so we would have to give him a few days to kind of just sleep it off, let his brain adjust to the new social context where now he's in the post-conflict resolution situation. And though through being mindful, he may notice some smaller units of emotion, right? So if he's very used to having like 40 unit, 50 unit, 70 unit of intensity, and there's like a 3, a 2, and like a 1.5, he may not notice these smaller disturbances, these upsets, because they're so small, because his mind is so used to having to hold space for these high content, like very ready to be an outburst at any time, right? And then we go down to here, these emotions are still important to discuss, but it's just you can't even sense that they're there, right? So we just give it a few days, let all of this content become a memory, and then from that position, because they may even change after, right? So one of the other criticisms, just to give you a criticism or a question, would be, well, what if the behavior doesn't change, right? Okay, we've accounted for this stuff in the past, but if this person relates to the world this way, there's a high probability it's going to happen again, right? Like tomorrow or even today, because the person can't tell. It's like if I'm blind and I walk into the wall and boom, and I can't see it, unless I have some visual aid, whether it's like a walking stick or glasses, I'm most likely going to repeat the behavior again, right? So if we look at person one who's demonstrating traits of narcissism, if that's the way they relate to the world, it's most likely they're going to do it again. And so what we do as a caveat, we say, well, let us not have the expectation it's never going to happen again. Let us have the expectation that if it does happen, this is how we will resolve it. And what we're really looking for is person one, because of how uncomfortable going through this process is, the pain of that is more, we want them to remember that feeling of having to be disciplined, or whatever you want to call it, right? So it demotivates them to be insulting in the first place. And if an association can be created that this behavior, this is what they mean by that, we've really almost solved one of the problems, right? Like, and part of the thing is not that you've said something insulting, but that you're thinking it, right? If you're thinking insulting things, it's only one step away when you start saying it. But if your thought's not even there in the first place, then there's nothing to be said. And so the real problem is the way that they're perceiving the world. And that's a different thing. Like, that is harder to deal with. But at least from a retroactive perspective, we can say, one, when a conflict or an incident occurs, we can have some methodology to deal with it. Proactively, how are we going to prevent it from ever happening? It may take 3 to 5 years. So not only conflict resolution, but a proactive, like, self-assessment. What am I? What does it mean to be me? What are my feelings? And you can try to, so this is the thing. I've done this for many years now. You can do it directly. You say, I want to sit down and talk to you. Oh my God, Achilles. That's intense for some people sometimes, right? I get that. And so what I do is, like I said, I was ready to do this resolution thing weeks in the past. It was like, it's not the right timing. It's better to wait, right? And when the opportunity presents itself, I can have already visualized and had a dialogue in my mind ready to go, so that when the opportunity is there, I can gracefully go through it with ease. Yeah.
So I would, two things. The first thing is I would like to relate this to a more overarching concept of dealing with narcissists. That's something that I think is big for you, and rightfully so. Like, it's like how to deal with narcissists. So it seems like in this case, you're identifying this person as some sort of like, you take that to work through these problems rather than putting taking the narcissist out of the group. You're trying to find how to rehabilitate narcissists in some ways. Would that be accurate?
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. And second, I know someone who does research on relationships. Gottman, I think. Maybe
Okay.
I've heard of it.
Sorry, on what relationship?
On relationships, generally relationships, romantic relationships mostly, but relationships as well. He identifies some factors, and one of these factors, he says, if this factor is broken, it is very difficult, extremely difficult to get the relationship back together. I do not recall that factor what it is, but it may be to your interest to see what that factor is that Gottman talks about, that when that factor is broken. It's he has done research, a lot of people. It's very difficult to get the relationship.
And you can't recall what that's called?
Can you send it to me in the group chat?
I can send the name of the researcher. I believe Gottman. I believe John Gottman. But I can send and then if that's the factors are searched, then it could be like a 10-minute search or something. Yeah.
Maybe it'd be easy to find like a video, and then we can watch it in the group, and then we can talk about it or something.
I'll send the name of the researcher for sure.
All right. Thank you.
No problem.
Yeah, and like, so my general approach here is, how do we solve the problem of mental illness And I feel that there's issues. The institution of mental health, its approach, just having practitioners that you see, like there's different, kinds of ways we approach this problem socially. But if we're going to say that the therapeutic setting is all that's required, it's not. I don't believe it's and we can see that because therapy isn't really useful for certain conditions, right? So I'm looking at it from like almost like a laboratory. Like the social context is like a laboratory, and really my main idea is I feel that this kind of a housing context with these relationships emulates our evolutionary past where we lived in small tribes. And if we can find a way to live together, really we've solved a lot of problems. Maybe all of them, any of the ones that we can really just solve through our relations with each other. If someone has brain damage and we need to have like an intervention in that way, that's different. But when it comes to just like how we live, and because this accounts for child rearing too, like how do we raise kids, and what's the best environment for children to grow in? And I think it's important for us to deal with these issues so that not only adults are okay, but then, our children are good too. So what are the limitations of this approach? When people do not follow through with the principles. Oh, cool. Great. Thanks. Do not follow through with the principles of the group cohesion. So some individuals it won't really work for. And those people, in a lot of ways, become incarcerated because they break the law and then they have to be put in jail because they're a risk to society. Retroactively, if they're already in jail, we can have some kind of a method like this to help that group context be more efficient and more effective. We want to kind of prevent these crimes from happening, though, really. And so that's a problem for another day, I think. For now, my approach is we're finding out what this kind of a methodology is with my prototype lab right now, and then developing a real estate investment firm where I can own like 50 properties, make it so that all of those properties are they can have multiple people living in them. So you would renovate them to emulate this group living context, and then train somebody to be the leader, and then apply this methodology. So some kind of a book that just explains it, or training program. And then the company owns all these properties and it facilitates this mental health paradigm indirectly by just doing conflict management, but also upholding these values that increase prosocial behavior and prevents mental illness and these kinds of things, right? So I think it's definitely doable. And it's tough, it's not necessarily easy, but it's definitely doable. And I'm learning a lot. And yeah, and I think that from an investor perspective, I can argue that it's best to invest in my company from a real estate context because the rent will always be paid. And you're helping out with these, these important issues in society, in contrast to just anybody else in the world who's going to own property, right? And so I'm not there yet, but it's in the mind. I will get there soon. So that's kind of like that approach. And other social contexts, I think there is a way to deal with it. I just don't have much experience there, so it's hard for me to speak on it. But in this context, I do have experience with it, so it's easy for me to kind of go through it. The main thing is that someone suffering from narcissism, when you establish the relationship, the leader establishes a relationship with them, you can regulate their behavior or help them regulate their behavior because of the value of being in the group and the value associated with the group. These kinds of things don't really exist. Like you could talk about cults and shit like that, but those are negative social contexts because of, some properties of cults is like they revere the leader and almost in a sense of worship. That's not what's going on. They give all their money to the group, which is not what's going on. And then they become excommunicated from their family and other members of society, which is not going on here. We actually want to reintegrate people and teach them how to bring these skills to everybody in the world. So, you know, I think that there's space for a social group that does these things. And some people it won't really work for because of their antisocial tendencies. Like if they're too manipulative, if they lie too much, there's other like behaviors that aren't good. Like if their self-care isn't really good. So there's a specific demographic that it'll apply to. And you can have like one person maybe that's a little, you know, not fully healthy. A ratio of like one bad and four good. If it gets to be too many, then you get issues of like a mutiny occurring and like the values start to change because it becomes like a democracy. And so if everybody values being disrespectful, whether they're explicit or implicit, that'll become the baseline. And so you're going to need to have a certain like degree of pro-social individuals that are already have good habits and a mindset. And then you can put in one person that needs work. When I say needs work, like 3 to 5 years of rehabilitation for them to get to a normal standard. You know, and there's different ways to do that. There's certain movies you can watch as a group. And then when you do that, it gives a visual example of the values, right? Like how do we get along in a group context? And, you know, as long as you can discuss it and you can show it, like people kind of pick their own stuff. But I have certain films that I show that are also part of the Philosophy Society. Like The Peaceful Warrior by Dan Millman. Another movie called Gattaca, that's really good. And other ones. And so, yeah, so this is important, and it's recent work that I've been working on. The other thing I was going to talk about, this kind of just came out because I was thinking about it, was when we're living our life and we are detecting our feelings, how do we navigate and make different decisions? Like, what is the best thing to do, like with your career or your relationships? And we can talk about different ways of knowing. One is we can be empirical. I can try out this new job. And then 2, I can just rationally think about it, right? And, you know, the problem with being rational in this sense is it is in contrast to feeling. That I might just like hold on to a career that really stresses me out. And then over time, you know, my well-being really does go down. And so I think that there's something to be said for being mindful of how, like, what we feel from our experience and what to do about that. Instead of, you know, thinking in our minds too much and then trying to fit ourselves to situations and say, for example, I must be okay with this workplace, you know? And maybe it's not. Like, maybe you're just something that goes against your values or the social structure that's there. And this is the thing, is like, do you run away from your problems or do you learn to deal with them? Like, at what point do I say, I'm not going to do this anymore? Because we could argue that, like, hey, like, you need to learn to be mature is to learn to integrate yourself into challenging situations and then be successful. Right? But how, like, it could be like you could be making yourself suffer unnecessarily. Whereas you could spend your time in a different environment where it meets your needs, like socially and financially and whatever, you know?
Is it to say what's the boundary between giving up and unnecessary suffering? How to find that boundary? How to reconcile? Is that something?
I think it's one of the most important things that we are going to be faced with throughout our lives. You know, like, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to clarify, reconcile what?
So I just wanted to make sure that I thought what Achille is talking about is sometimes we don't want to give up, but it can go to the border of unnecessary suffering. So I was thinking that he is trying to reconcile these two concepts, and I asked to clarify.
And you were also saying, at which point do you say, I'm not going to do this anymore? I just want to add to that. I think research for people with PTSD, you know, what they're working on is to make sure that it's treated whilst it's acute before it goes into chronicity. So probably at the point where it's acute would probably be the best time to kind of treat it and stop it before it gets to a state where it's permanent. I think, which is the unnecessary suffering. I think that's what you're talking about. Just to connect with what you're talking about.
Could be.
Does that make sense? Or
Yeah, it makes sense.
Like, for example, I was a bartender, right? And whenever I think, and it's so funny that like I engaged in self-sabotage. Like, I quit the one bartending job and I was like, I'm gonna find a new one tomorrow, just to work. And I went into the interview and I didn't really care, like I didn't get the job, the next one. And when I reflect back and when I think about being a bartender or a server, I get this visceral like disgust for the job. Like, I fucking hate it. I don't like it, I really don't. Like, if you were like, when we talk about self-awareness, when you're aware of me, you're an other aware of myself. When I'm aware of myself, I may not notice the same things or pay attention to the same things. So like, there are some parts about that environment that I do like, but I can get almost all of that from just being a customer, in contrast to being an employee of that place, right? And listening to your feelings in some ways is accepting that you just don't like this. And part of the problem is that other people can tell you what they think you should do. Like our parents and stuff like that in our early developmental stages, right? And we're like, I need to do this because this is what I'm supposed to do or whatever. Like, we have these thoughts and beliefs in our head, but they're not conducive to our well-being. And we keep on doing it, And yeah, and so the point is like, I remember sitting at that bar for like many shifts, just feeling like I don't like this. But I got into like a pattern and a habit, and I just had learned helplessness, basically. I didn't know there was another way, And that's an issue, and we can get stuck in those mindsets. And that's why it's like, sometimes there will be like a spike of intensity, like a really negative emotion that occurs, like in this circumstance with these people. And that is actually an opportunity for growth, because psychologically it's distinct from just the normal hum of stress. When there's an incidence that's like really, really high, that's the moment where you can use that to like move to a different position in your life. And there's like a new graph over here or whatever. But if you just stay in a context or an environment that you can tolerate, you actually like force yourself to prevent yourself from growing simply by, coping with it, when really there's a better way of life for you,
I read somewhere that a person is usually that spike you're talking about, that comes in the form of if the person either suffers just about enough or if they receive enough. And those two situations allow them to kind of, it's a leaping pad for them to change.
Mm-hmm.
So receiving just what they needed, or suffering to the point that it makes them reevaluate where they're at in life. Does that?
Yeah. Like the reason I left was because the employer was very unfair to me. They made an agreement and then they didn't follow through with the agreement. And I really put a lot of effort in like a 8 days straight during the holidays. Their treatment of me, that specific situation, violated certain values I have. Like, it really went against my identity. Whereas some people might not give a shit. They're like, whatever, And so they may have not had the impetus to leave. But in a specific circumstance, it was just against my values. And so it's important to be mindful of that. And even though in the moment, it may have been difficult because you have to deal with the stress of job loss and all these other stressors and stuff, like, that sucks. I get that, But in the long run, it's actually better for you. There's a short-term loss for a long-term gain. And some people can say that's reckless, like, don't just quit a job, But at the same time, like, maybe there's no other way out. Or it could be a relationship, there's a whole bunch of different things that we can become stagnant. And the thing about stagnancy is time is still going on. Like you're still slowly moving through it. And so, yeah, what do we do about that? And how do we identify other instances of stagnancy that we may not be aware of, such that when you're in the future and you reflect and look back, you're like, okay, I did everything that was good for me. I don't want to to live a good life in some ways means I didn't miss out on what's important for me. Like part of me wants to go to the bookstore. It's a super nerdy thing. DMV, I love it because books are great value and they're cheap. But I haven't gone, I've had this feeling for a little while. I don't feel like I'm missing out too much. It's like an option. Instead, I'll take my dog to the beach, and meet people and stuff. Yeah.
Okay, so I would say one problem here could be that how to identify that we are not giving up, because we could feel that it's like, again, the boundary between giving up and stagnancy.
Mhm.
Because I could move on from a certain thing and say, okay, I'm not stagnant, but at the same time, it's the balance of not giving up. What do you feel about that?
Well, when we identify a goal, right? A goal is a condition that is not currently present, that's desired, right? Because if I desire wearing a blazer, it's like I have a goal of having a blazer on. Doesn't make sense because I currently have that, right? So I could have a goal of like being in my car. And so for me to accomplish that goal, I would have to travel there and then enter it, and then I'm in the car, right? Some goals may be more challenging than others. And if I'm aware, so part of it is an accurate evaluation of how challenging the goal really is. So with the bartending job, maybe my problem was just that I wasn't accurately evaluating how much I disliked the job. And if I did, I was like, it's gonna be really hard for me, this job. Because I would always go in thinking it's super easy. It's an easy job. But is it easy? Maybe not. Maybe it's super stressful. Because a lot of people there are stressed. I'm stressed. I need to accurately evaluate the challenge of the goal. And if we know how challenging the goal is, then I can compensate for that challenge. So, because giving up on everything that's challenging isn't conducive to our growth. You know what I mean? Then you're just like taking the easy way out. And I don't know how much achievement you can really have, which may go contrary to the good life. So some goals are going to be difficult, and part of it is being realistic. Yeah.
So there an element of sacrifice there in order to achieve the good life. So when we say that growth does not occur within a comfort zone, and being in a comfortable position all the time may actually be detrimental to your life and to your health. So is there an element of sacrifice there, would you say?
I'm not going to say necessarily the case. Like, what do we mean by sacrifice? Like, I'm giving something up, I'm suffering, like...
Yeah, you're allowing, there's a threshold of suffering that you are allowing in your life that is controlled, but in the long term, it will yield a favorable result.
Yeah, we can be talking, like, I just don't like sacrifice because as a term, it has like this weird, like witch burning connotation to it or something like that. Or like I'm burning the goat or giving something up to the gods. Yeah. I would replace it with something else that has maybe the same meaning.
Sure.
So like some kind of exchange, putting in effort, like there's some, and I would say for sure, like when we think of, so again, like there's a person and then this is their present state, and the goal is something that's outside of their present state. And then you determine which one you're going to work towards. And then when you have successfully gained the goal, it's inside your present state. Like this is part of my, what's in my control or whatever. Like I just got the frame for my degree. Picked up the degree like last week or something, and the frame came in the mail, $40, better than $200 at the bookstore. I could spend $160 on other stuff, like this new drill I bought, Could have bought that $200 frame, but I didn't. So to bring this in, this property that the person identifies, like a degree or whatever, or a new relationship or this, that, and the other thing, we have to identify the steps to getting there. So what is this? And we could talk about intelligence, awareness, like your ability to know what those things are is important for you to be successful, right? Maybe there's some degree of chance, like it just happened. Like if your locus of control in life is that you don't have control and things just happen, you're kind of not really taking any responsibility for that. You're kind of just saying like, I'm just a random person and the environment just does stuff to me. Okay, I guess so, but not really. I do make decisions. I do have some control. You know what I mean? And so when we go back to our values, which goals are important? And what's the priority sequence of these goals? Right? And so like well-being, like there's different things that are important to us. Our relationships, our partners, like whatever it might be. And like one of my mistakes is just like taking too many university classes, and then I get overwhelmed and my well-being goes down, and then all of my relationships get affected because I'm not good. And so when I relate to other people, I'm not being good to them. Right? And so my priority was try to do as much school as I can in a short period of time, but then I'm sacrificing this other thing. You know what I mean? And so it's unrealistic of me to think that I can handle that much. If I was in like a vat and I had no social relationships or any other responsibility, then sure. But I have a lot of responsibility. I have a lot. Like it's just, I actually do. And it's not that I don't know. It's just, that's just be realistic. Like you need to do this stuff. It's like if you have a family or like children, like you do have a lot of responsibility. And to think that you don't, like being 19 or 20, it's like, how much responsibility do you really have at that point? Or being like, 15 or something like that, like when I was very young. Evaluating the goal, super important. The giving up on the goal, maybe it was an inaccurate assessment, and then the person is taking a lot of damage in the attainment of the goal. For example, I want to go up top of the mountain. I have no shoes, right? That wasn't the best strategy or preparation to be successful in attaining the goal, right? Shoes would have been good for you, maybe hiking boots or some rope or something, or a backpack with water, right? And so, because just to say that I'm going to accept only the goals that fall in my lap is that it's just, I don't think that's realistic either, And then to not prepare for the attainment of the goal is going to make it very difficult to get there. And we might get stressed, we can get sick, a whole bunch of things can happen, right? So as we're going through life, it's important to have this kind of awareness so that that's what I would say growth is. Growth is identifying some specific goal and finding a way to get there. Like, for example, I don't have my PhD right now, and I'm not currently employed by any university as a professor. That was a goal for me in the past. But what's really the goal? The goal is for me to express this information. And I don't think there's any course that they may not even let me teach this stuff. Like I could, if like there's a guy that works at this university, at Toronto Metropolitan University, who's a year older than me. And I think they're going to give him tenure in the next year or so, right? And he teaches philosophy, but he teaches the courses that they want him to teach, right? Whereas I'm teaching what I think is important based on the courses I've done. So this is like a course that doesn't even exist. I'm taking all of the things I've learned and I'm putting into a pragmatic, useful format that I think is philosophical. You know what I mean? And so I value having the recording because at least I have this data, and then I can go back and like write a book on it or whatever.
What do I think so far? Okay, can I have a few seconds?
The goal thing, that's the thing that was really today's topic. We did this stuff as like a tangent just to get it in there, but yeah. Going from feeling to the goal. So as you're progressing to our goal, we have feelings, and sometimes our feelings will say, I don't like this. But then the mind would say, yeah, but you committed to this goal.
So I think one way to reconcile we talked about the reconciliation between feeling of giving up and whether it's giving up or whether it's like moving forward. I think to put this comparison in relation to your goal, right? So then it would make the decision easier. Am I giving up? Or is it just, or am I just being stagnant? How is this related to my goal? So, yeah, what do you think about that? Like, I think that could help. That could be helpful.
Because I think that part of the issue is the value. What do you value more, A or my state? You know, because like, for example, divorce is a real thing. People had a goal. It was a lifelong commitment, but then they're like, I don't like this anymore, you know? And then they decide to get divorced for whatever reason, right? And you could say that cheating is a sickness. So if you agreed sickness and health, but then it violated some value that you had, you know, as an example, like the one main thing is like cheating, or like maybe being in an abusive relationship. You know, those are the legitimate reasons to get divorced, usually in society. But yeah, it's not a universal all conditions contract. Like, people do back out of it, and part of the reason they back out is because of the way they feel. Their needs aren't being met, you know, in a variety of different ways, and they decide to terminate that relationship. So yeah, I think that that's a really good example of this. And there are other ones in our life. And so I think to be wise is, as you're going through life, it would be good to have some awareness of this. What goals do we choose? And how do we get there? And when do we disengage from those goals? When is it appropriate to say this is not worth pursuing anymore? Right? And how do we know that that's correct? So yeah, that's where we're at for today, basically. So we talked about the feeling. I gave an example of how to deal with emotions, and the expression of those emotions in a pretty extreme situation actually resolved it in itself. And then so that's in a group context and relationships, but then there's just feeling for ourselves within our own life, our own being. And how do we deal with that? Independent of other people. If there's no other human existed, you can still have goals. Right? Or if you're in a spaceship going into space for however long and you're never going to die, like, could you survive? Some people would say no, because you go crazy. But yeah, I try to think about that as a situation like, am I ready to go onto the spaceship and just be in darkness forever? You know? Can I do it yet? And I'm like, I don't know. Is that an achievable goal? To have that mental stability, to be one with myself so much that if it was like the fate of humanity, like how many people could go into that shuttle and just be gone forever or whatever, you know? Who knows? But it just, yeah, interesting. So, okay. Let's think about this a bit more throughout the next week, about this goal setting thing and how to get there and what the goals are most important. I think it's related to our identity. I think that the solution to this is there's some values that are related to the human condition. And one of those values is well-being. And there's certain things that are objective that will change this in itself. And if we're aware of those objective standards, then it will give us the ability to disengage from goals that we thought were good, but were not. And the difference here is being empirical and being rational. So be rational, but then be open to experiencing something and testing it out and saying, is this really for me? Because if it's not, you only have so much time. So it's not good to waste it. Right? All right, that's it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That was great.